and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you're receiving this information, my name is Rafael Vasquez Guzman, and this is your show, Chisme is Life. This podcast aims to educate and more than anything, just have conversations that matter to the Latinx community. Whether you identify as Hispanic, Latinx, Indigenous, somebody from the original peoples of this land, so on and so forth, welcome to this conversation. At some point, we'll have a whole different conversation about what it is to be Latinx. Am I Hispanic? Am I Chicano? So on and so forth. But today, we're talking about identity from the perspective of clothing and how do we express ourselves as either Chicano or Latinx or Latine or Latina or Latino and so on and so forth. So we have the wonderful opportunity to bring to this conversation Erandi Hernandez Aguilar, who I've known for a couple of years now. Erandi, you're now a college student at a university. And so welcome. Thank you for taking the time from your studies to be here and have this. I think it's going to be a positive conversation today.
Yes, I'm excited. Huaraches, everyone. Nice to, I guess, meet you in a way.
Yeah. And again, and that's where the conversation starts. What did you just say in your language?
Huaraches is, my abuelita taught me, it can vary depending on region, but my abuelita taught me that Huaraches means, for example, good afternoon. Other regions, the spelling can change and it varies. Like I mentioned, the language does change depending on the region. The pronunciation does change. For example, some people, in some words, we have eyes at the end. And so some people pronounce the eyes, other people don't, or the pronunciation changes. For example, cuate can be pronounced cuate or cuati or cuat perhaps. So yeah, that's just something to take into account. But Huaraches is like a saludo, I guess you could say, that you would typically use in the afternoon. I know I've also heard that it can be like hello everyone. So again, like the definition or the meaning does change depending on the region.
In what language was it?
In Purepecha. So my people are native to, well, my family, I'm Purepecha on my mom's side. And my family is specifically native to Huataru. Huataru is the Sierra or the Meseta Purepecha, which is located in what is commonly known as Michoacan.
Definitely. And so again, this is where we want to start this conversation because unlike a lot of other, again, Latinos, Hispanics, so on and so forth, you were born in the U.S., but you are one of those individuals who is very much working towards reconnecting with your ancestry. And part of that is your clothing. I remember that when you graduated from Santa Rosa Junior College, you showed up dressed in your clothing that represents the Purepecha people, your ancestors. And people were approaching you, right? Because it's a new thing for them. And somebody asked how much was the dress that you were wearing, so on and so forth. And sometimes it's because they are from that region, and sometimes it just looks cool. Let's start the conversation. Why is it important for you to connect or reconnect with your ancestors?
So for me, I do want to start off that my abuelita, I do want to recognize where credit is like given, right? For me, my connection to my Purepecha identity has been maintained and connected because of my abuelita. She put in the effort, right, when she migrated. And that's the other thing is my Nandekere didn't migrate just once, right? She migrated twice. She migrated from Pamatacuaro, which is located in the Sierras, and it's rural, to the Ciudad de Mexico, where she faced discrimination there for not speaking Spanish. And so despite that, right, after staying 17 years, I believe, in La Ciudad de Mexico, after the peso was devalued, they migrated to what is now the United States. and cross the colonial structure, which is commonly referred to as la frontera, the border, whatever you want to call it. Um, but it's also important to recognize that a lot of people who are crossing the border aren't just, Mexican or de Guatemala. You also have to dive deep into these identities. There's lots of indígena people from pueblos originarios that are forced to migrate because of interference or influence from other nations such as the US government, right? The violence that they inflict other organizations or corporations, because it's not just a government, it's different corporations that are looking to exploit natural resources. So that's another thing that we have to look at. But my abuelita, she did a lot of work, not only growing up hearing the language, my abuelito occasionally, but also my tío Pancho. I remember when I was younger, he would always be talking in Purepecha. He would always be, on the phone with my Nandes Apichus, Erendira, and all my other tias that were in Michoacán. And they would always be speaking in Purepecha, always, always, always. And I remember I have like a vivid memory of, before preschool. And I think it's sometimes not a little silly, but I think it's interesting how people sometimes, challenge people's memories from when they were younger. Like there's no way you could have remembered that. But it's like when there's memories or experiences that are super impactful, they stick with you. And so I remember my tío attempting to teach me, first starting off a little like intermediate, right? Teaching me the numbers 1 through 10 in Purepecha before I went to preschool, I think, or it was kindergarten. Um, before actually going into like learning other languages outside of like Spanish and Purepecha. And so, I do remember having that memory, and then eventually whatever I did learn, I did lose, and Spanish as well. I saw that, and there's other people who have that similar experience. Once they've started kindergarten, where it's instilled in us that we have to learn this language, the dominant language that is within this country that we're residing in. And then how that language can also be used as a tool. But yeah, so looking at my abuelita, I remember her growing up using the vestuario and using the rebozo, and I also there's a picture that my mom has where she dressed me desde niña as a baby in my vestuario. So it's like me with the rebozo on my head and a wanengo. It was one of the white wanengos with like the punta de cruz here. And then I think there was like a little mini skirt with the que estaba plisado. So it was, I don't know how you would say plisado in English, but it's like multiple layers. And so I remember having that, and I remember my mom telling me, like, oh, like this is something that is important to our culture. It's something that we do. We dress our babies in our traditional regalia and our traditional clothes, to signify like the importance and connection of culture, and also to like maintain that connection of culture despite being far from home. And I truly am grateful for my abuelita, because I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have my abuelita, right? And recognizing the privilege that I have in having my abuelita and in being able to communicate with her, because that's like another thing that we do have to take into account when reconnecting or when connecting with our culture and encouraging others to connect with culture, is you have to look at what privileges you as a person have and recognize the other like positionalities of people, and how maybe their grandparents only speak their native language and don't speak Castellano or Spanish or English, or maybe they don't know Spanish, or there's sometimes the language is the barrier that prevents us from being able to connect with our culture. And we have to recognize as well like what caused that, right? And it's colonization, occupation, which continues to go on. It's not something in the past. We also have to recognize that we're still living under occupation. We're still enduring colonial violence, and it looks like and it shows up in our day-to-day lives in different ways and forms. But yeah, and then I remember I still have the rebozo actually from when I was younger. I didn't bring it with me here, but it is like a little bit older, and you can tell that it's older by like the way that it's I have my rebozo here with me. the one that I got the last time that I went to Pama. And you can tell like I've been using it a lot. Like it's the little bolitas, they like
Mhm.
in, and I think I had like candle wax on here from the last time that I went to the pueblo and we had a peregrinación. But like these ends on my original rebozo, like from when I was a kid, are like all wrapped up, and twisted. But it's something that I still use today, and because of like how important, culture is to us, or my abuelita taught us. When my brother and my kunis had my nephew, I remember like wanting to wrap him up in the rebozo because that was such a pivotal, memory and part of our culture. Is like I remember my abuelita. I remember seeing her carrying my cousins in the rebozo, and she would tell me that too, like, "Oh, I carried you in my rebozo," and telling us about that, the cultural significance, and that's I think something that I also do want to share, like a story that I believe it was my nande, so my mom told me about how in our pueblo it's customary to carry children in rebozos, um, and I also remember like my abuelita telling me other stories similar to this one, but how having that connection with the baby from mother and baby, signifying the closeness and having the baby close to the heart and hearing the heartbeat, but also feeling the warmth, establishing and strengthening that connection between mother and child. Um, and so yeah, and so when I think about like rebosos and I think about like regalia or traditional clothing, I think a lot about my nande Keri, and my nana Keri, so my mama abuela, my abuelita's mom,
Mhm.
and how in my perspective, I feel that something that is true to my experience is how matriarchs show up in our lineages and how they continue to strengthen and lead us in different ways and forms. Yeah.
It's interesting how once the oppressor showed up, the oppressor pushed for the minimization of the contributions of women as caretakers, but also leadership, right? They're the ones that really keep things together, keep families together, but also guide the next generations. And so it's important to recognize that not everybody is privileged as you are to have access to your grandma here in California, because other children who are born in the US, maybe their parents are undocumented, and unless they travel to their small villages or communities, they don't get access. But you did all these years, and I've been privileged to have met your grandma a couple of times. And again, she carries this personality that is strong yet caring, right? And I think many of us who were privileged to have a grandma um, had that experience, that connection, the ability to sit on the floor and just chit chat with grandma, and grandma telling you stories that decades later you're like, oh, this is what they meant, or this is how it connects to this situation, or this helps me stay grounded in regards to my culture and my ancestry. And so for you, your regalia, you're wearing these beautiful pieces right now, from your earrings to your necklace and other clothing. How important is it for you to go out into the world representing the indigenous communities? Because what you carry is not just unique to the Purepecha peoples, but sometimes is maybe you got earrings from another community, right? Why is it important to you to share with the world? I'm not gonna wear, name brand clothing all the time, perhaps, because this is name brand clothing for me. This is my peoples that I carry. What can you educate us about?
For me, I think about, the time that takes into creating these beautiful pieces. I think I really truly started I want to say intentionally dressing myself in this way. I want to say maybe the ends of high school, because I think that's when my worldview and my perspective on the world truly shifted. Because I'm like, in all honesty, this is still an ongoing journey, right? It's not something we just stop. We learn about something and then we just stop learning. No, it's something we're actively learning and continuing to do. But I want to say it was like around senior, maybe possibly junior year. Because I was intentionally asking questions about my culture, about my name. And I think that's like also like another thing is how our names are sometimes, the first thing that people know about us, about our own perspective, I mean, not perspective, but identities.
Mhm.
And so for a long time, my name Erandi, it's not a common name here, not something that's normalized. And so I remember, like, for years, people would mispronounce my name. They would pronounce it Arandi. And I didn't necessarily speak up and say, like, oh, that's not how you pronounce it, because I didn't necessarily, I wasn't consciously aware of the importance, and I hadn't asked my mom, right? Like, what led you to choosing my name? Or I didn't take it into account or view it as important perhaps at the time. And so later on, it was reflecting on that, and then, asking my mom again, like, hey, what is it, what led you to choosing my name, Mirandi, and stuff like that. And her telling me, right, like, the purpose or the reason why I wanted to give you this name Erandi, which is one of the phases within our Purepecha culture, because we have different names for phases of like the sun. Um, and so Erandi means amanecer, or más bien like before sunrise, so just before the sunlight peaks over like the mountains. And so after having that conversation and her telling me, like, that's why I gave it to you, because I wanted you to have this connection to culture despite, not being able to grow up within the same ancestral homelands or within the trojes, or like, as our ancestors. And so it was like after that my whole like kind of worldview shifted. And I remember like jokingly telling my friends, oh, when I have kids, if I have kids, I'm gonna give them like a name that's like so rare. And I was like already thinking about having a Purepecha name, but wanting it to be culturally significant. And at that time, I would joke about like, oh, so they could know what it was like to go through what I experienced. But then now, like, the intention behind that shifted. It's not like jokingly anymore. Now it's more like serious. Like, I am wanting to have, the future generations continue this way and this to walk this way of life, and have that connection to culture, because I've seen what it's done for me. And so yeah. And then the other thing was, I wear my regalia or my traditional clothing because I saw my abuelita wearing it. And so for a while that was like normal to me because I saw her, wearing it. And so that became my normal. And there was also like, remember, right? It's like an ongoing journey. And, within my journey, there was a time when I turned 15, that my abuelita, like they want to do quinces. I didn't want a quince. At that time, I preferred a car. I still don't know how to drive, but at that time, I didn't want a quince. I just wanted to be with family, whether it was a carne asada. I didn't really care. I just wanted to be with my family. And I remember like my abuelita or like them wanting to push like a quince onto me. And I just didn't want that. And then I remember when it came like the carne asada for my birthday, that she wanted to either she had like, oh, you can dress up in your cousin's, old quince dress. And then I also remember her like taking me to her house and wanting me to put on our traditional regalia, the whole vestuario. And I didn't know that she had purchased a specific, traje for me, meant for my 15 as a gift. And I didn't learn that until afterwards. And I didn't take into account how significant or important that could have been for me until later on, right? Reflecting on that. And so it's like, damn, I could have been, within this moment, I could have started like, not started, but like my worldview could have shifted, right? Within that moment. And it wasn't until like afterwards that I reflected, that I realized the opportunity that I had missed out on. Um, and so senior year, right? Like I remember my first wanengo that I had used was actually my mom's. And so we jokingly always talk about how like I took it or I stole it from her. And my abuelita was always like, no, no, sí, mija, úsalo, like she would always like encourage me to use it. And she's like, doesn't matter if your mom is like, te anda reclamando, like, oh, when am I gonna get my wanengo back, right? Like, use it because I see you, showing up like that out in the world, not just at home, not just at, convivencias with the family. You're actively showing like up like that and intentionally showing up like that out in the world, out in the community and in public. Um, and I remember like feeling comfortable in, my wanengos, um, and feeling like I feel like that was like the first time I truly felt like beautiful or recognized the beauty within myself, and like within those awkward teen years and stuff like that. So it was again like showing me or allowed me to reflect how important traditional clothing is to identity. And another thing is like I choose and intentionally choose to show up in my regalia with my rebosos, with my wanengos, to actions, protests, marches, because again it's like it's not only I'm visibilizing my people and I'm representing my people, but it's also taking up space. There was we hear about like oral histories and we read about it, about how our people were, oppressed and how, for a long time this was criminalized, right? Our people were told that we couldn't continue with our traditions, that we, couldn't, continue our way of life. And so that's why I continue to show up with my wanengos, with my reboso. And the other thing is like when I'm at actions, when I remember when I first started getting involved, it's a little nerve-wracking, it's a little scary, and I have social anxiety and I have anxiety. And so I remember like, putting on the reboso, and each time I put on the reboso, I feel my ancestors with me, and it reminds me of again of like the being like a little baby or a characo, right? And being wrapped up in a reboso. So each time I come out or I have my regalia, I feel my ancestors with me and I know that they're protecting me. And so it's like in a way armor, I guess you could say, and it makes me feel more protected and secure and, yo misma. But yeah.
And that's important because it's interesting because in your household, you're really like into this, like 100%, right? And then you have your siblings who are like, kind of like whatever almost, right? How much of it is that because you're a female rather than your siblings who are males? And then two, how important is it for you to, or for people to not necessarily disrespect your clothing? Because again, what happens, and we saw it at graduation, where somebody just comes over and says, oh, I really like that. How much is it? Blah, blah, blah. And it's not about, and at least from my perspective, because I was there with you, I didn't think it was an honest question because they value the cultural story that goes with that. It was more like, oh, it looks nice. I wonder how much it was, right? Like when you go to the store and you're like, oh, I like that, those pants or that shirt, and I'm just going to buy them without understanding the many pieces that come with it. How important is it for you that people respect it and not just be touching your things and all of that stuff? Because again, it has value that maybe other people don't understand.
Yeah, and I realized also that I didn't answer one of your previous questions, so I do want to touch up on that. In terms of like also buying, jewelry or yeah, mainly I buy jewelry from other nations. So for me, for example, I like to invest and intentionally invest in my local native community. So it's also about like getting familiar with who are your, whose land are you on? Recognize, that you're a settler, I am on Wiyot land, and it's not just Wiyot people here, there's 12 different nations out here. And so it's also recognizing where you're at, whose land you're on, and also recognizing the history that has happened here, the violence that has happened in the place that you are currently in. And for me, intentionally investing in native vendors is, for me, an act of resistance, because I'm not investing in like these big corporations like Nike or all these other corporations, that we know are also funding genocide that is ongoing and happening in Palestine and another, different native nations. And so for me, it's not just like about investing, but also, you're also, the other thing that comes into account when you're buying these things is like, you also, I encourage people to ask about the earrings and what is it that, the meaning behind them, or the labor, right? Because that's another thing. We also have to acknowledge the labor that goes behind it. And I think that's something that people don't take into account when they see things. They just see something nice, right? Or something shiny, pretty, and they're like, ooh, I want that. And then they ask, how much is it? And then when they're given a price, they're like, ooh, I don't know that I would pay that much. And it's like, you're disregarding the time, the effort, the history that's like going behind these pieces. And you're just looking at it because, again, right, you're looking at it through a certain type of lens of just like, ooh, shiny, I want something shiny, I want other people to see how I'm like, not necessarily presumiendo, but like showing off that you have something shiny or something blingy. And for me, it's like, some of the things that I buy, I either buy because, for example, this is turquoise that I bought at the Stanford powwow that I had gone with my close friend Lauritzin and with their mom. And I bought it because I know that my peoples use turquoise, and green for me, because my specific region in our bandera purepecha, we have 4 different regions represented on the flag. One of them is Huataru, which is my region, the Sierra. The other one is Hapondaru, which is the lake region. And I want to say the other one is representing the Once Pueblos, and I believe that color is specifically associated with yellow. Hapondaru is blue, and purple, I want to say it may be Erashamandu. I may be wrong with that, but it's it's the colors represent these different regions. And so for me, I mean, green was already my favorite color, and it just gave it a little even more of a special meaning. So you'll see me a lot in like different like clothing. Either the clothing is green, the jewelry is green, but I'm constantly representing my people in that way. And I think another thing to take into account is also liston, right? Like braiding, and how trenzas are also part of various pueblos originarios cultures, and also seeing how that is becoming a trend and how that is being co-opted by different cultures that didn't necessarily practice that custom. And I find it truly frustrating at times, because I hear from my abuelita the experiences, the discrimination that she had to face by the very same people oftentimes who are wanting, right, to exploit our culture, and who are only picking and choosing what parts of our culture they're wanting to keep or they're wanting for themselves, and then completely disregarding also the cultural meaning behind it and the cultural significance behind it. And so with my liston, that's like another thing, is my Nandesa Pichu, Bertita, and Liliana taught me, that, because when I had gone recently on my past trip back home to Pamatacuaro, I was wearing my hair in liston with trenzas, and I remember I like to experiment with my hair sometimes. So sometimes before going out, I'll like try different braiding styles. Sometimes they come to me in dreams. Sometimes I'm just like, what, let's go this route, because there's just something within me that just wants to try it out. Or because I see my my other fellow pures who are showing up in this way in the community, I'm like, oh, that looks really cute, I want to do that. Let me ask, what led you to this? What's the purpose of this? Why is it that we wear this certain hairstyle for this occasion? Asking about that. And also, like, I remember like my Nandesa Pichu Liliana, she was telling me, oh, we'll go green first because we're from we're from Huataru, and so it's like also actively learning, right? Again, coming in, how I'm actively learning that, and there's always moments of teaching and stuff. So it's like you know sometimes within quote unquote simple conversations, right, or conversations that you're having passing by can have like truly teaching moments that you can carry, and you can continue to either teach to someone else or actively apply within your own life. And in terms of when it comes to, right, like buying regalia, I practice, and I think it varies on depends on the person, but I like to buy my own regalia in terms of like of my own peoples. So I'll buy wanengos, I'll buy my rebosos, typically buy purepecha people, and that's the other thing is when you're buying cultural pieces, you also have to recognize what is made um like a mano and como de punto de cruz, right? And then also what is being mass produced, and that's something that I'm grateful that my Nandekeri had taught me,
Mhm.
is like being able to identify what blusas or wanengos are made, de máquina, using machinery to make, multiple pieces of the same thing for the purpose of, mass producing and getting a lot of money. And we're seeing how, again, our culture continues to be exploited by these different people and corporations, and it's detrimentally impacting pueblos originarios. We saw it happen with Adidas, right? Was it
Mhm.
Adidas with the Huaraches?
The Huaraches.
Um,
And
and it's
Puma
like,
just released some Dia de los Muertos shoes just this week. So again, the cultural appropriation.
yeah, it's like it's recognizing also the intent, but it's also intent versus impact, right? You're wanting to represent culture. There's different ways to go about that. I don't think necessarily mass producing is the way to go with that. It's not, and if you truly want to, represent culture, why not go to the original peoples who, create this and who have this long history of creating this, and the other thing is like, again, how I mentioned earlier, my abuelita, my abuelito, and other people from pueblos originarios are oftentimes forced to move out of their ancestral homes because they don't have money, or there aren't enough job opportunities back home. Because something that my nande, my mom, right, my nande keri, my abuelita have told me is how my nande kere on my dad's side, on my abuelito's side, she used to weave baskets, but it's something that they brought up is like how many baskets do I have to weave in order to provide for my family, a meal. Maybe it takes 20 just to get $5 or something, right? And that's something that we also have to take into account, is sometimes people are forced to devalue their own work to make it, I guess, in a way more attainable for others, or make it, so that, okay, that's something that they take into account sometimes, is like, sometimes I need money to survive for my family, for me, and so we also have to take that into account. And so when things like this happen, with what happened with the Huaraches and Adidas, you're wanting to go, represent culture, but you're not actually representing culture, and in fact you're devaluing culture, and so I think for me, if you're wanting to, have huaraches, why are you gonna buy from, like Nike or Adidas? Why not buy from the people who actually made this, who were the original creators, right? And that's like another thing, is like sometimes not sometimes, a lot of times, things that are made by pueblos originarios, native peoples, or other, peoples from the BIPOC community, they're when their creations are exploited but also taken, and now someone else is the creator, they're the ones who created it, not this person, who it's part of their culture, but now this other person who is part of this dominant culture, and they're colonizing it. We have to call it as it is. They're colonizing the clothing. And we see it in a lot of different ways with like Western clothing, right? No, that's just again, exploiting native culture. That's not Western or whatever. It's not country. It's native culture. And so that's like things that we have to take into account. And then the other, what was the other question? My bad, I forgot.
This is going to lead to the piece where you're going to read your poem, because it's about how do you feel about people like just touching your stuff that again has great value to you, but that often people just minimize, right? And so I think it connects to um, both your coletas, your clothing, and so on and so forth with this poem that you wrote. I think it brings all of these pieces together. So whenever you're ready, share that. And then just for people who are listening, there's going to be a little bit of swearing. Emotions are important. And then we can kind of talk more about it.
Yeah, so like I do remember you were mentioning, right, how when for my junior college, from when I graduated from the Santa Rosa Junior College, I wore my vestuario, and it was actually the same vestuario that I wore when I graduated from high school, right? That's where, again, when I had mentioned, like, that's when my worldview changed and shifted in my junior or senior year, around that time. And so that's something that I chose to do, right? I was wanting to represent my people and showing that we're still here. You know, we're not just something that's part of the museum. We're not a past, we're present. We're still here. We're actively, you know, breathing. We're actively talking. We're actively showing up in different spaces. And so for me, I first initially wanted it to be a surprise for my Nande Kere, right? Recognizing and honoring her in that way. But because I needed to get the vestuario, right? And she's the one who is able to go back and forth from back home and here. And she knows where to get it. I had to like tell her like, hey, I'm wanting to do this for my graduation. And so that was like a process too, calling, seeing which one I wanted and stuff like that. And so it was the same one that I wore for my high school graduation. And actually, there's a picture that Daisy had taken of me when I graduated, because she was there for one of her nieces, I believe. And so she sent me when I was, I think, maybe the first few weeks I was here at within Gudini, which is the the area in which we're in right now in the Wiyot language. It's commonly known as Arcata, but is actually Gudini, right? And that's how we're also continuing to resist, is we have to name the places as they were originally called by the original peoples that inhabited these places and continue to live here, right? But yeah, and so when the person, like you mentioned, I also was like a little thrown off, and it's not like the first time that it's happened. It happens lots of times, and lots of times it isn't genuine, and that's also why it'll occasionally rub me the wrong way. And it's also something that, you know, because of that, it makes me wonder, like, what is this person's intent in wanting to know, right? And how a lot of times it's like, oh, we need to get one of those. We need to get one of those. Like, is it, you know, culturally significant? Do you have a connection, a cultural connection to that? You have to recognize there are, you know, important cultural significance behind these pieces. You know, they're not just punto de cruz. They tell a story, you know, and these are, you know, things that are passed down within generation and generation. And so you have to think about that. And so, you know, like you were saying, right, a lot of people just see the beautiful part of it, and they don't take into account the labor that goes into that, the cultural significance that goes into that, the storytelling that goes into that, and the thought. And so, and also, like, what is it that was gathered to create this, right? And so, you know, it does occasionally, you know, rub me the wrong way, especially, and you can tell most of the time in the form or the way that they phrase the question, and you can kind of tell what it is that they're wanting to do, whether it's like, oh, I just want it because it's beautiful and it's pretty, and I'm seeing it on you and I'm wanting to, you know, have that on me. But it's also like, you have to recognize there's cultural connection to it and cultural significance to it again. And, you know, it's not just, clothing, but it's, archiving, actively archiving and storytelling. And yeah, and so like the other thing when you were saying, right, about touching clothing is like you never want to touch that. I actually had an experience with that. You never want to touch people's stuff because, for one, why would you touch someone you don't even know? Why would you touch someone without their consent? That's something that you have to ask, is like, hey, can I touch this? And a lot of times you have to ask yourself, is this question that I'm about to phrase, or about to pose, is that going to make someone uncomfortable? Is that, am I crossing a boundary with that? You have to take that moment to reflect before asking the question. Because lots of times myself and my friends, when we wear our beaded earrings or our jewelry, lots of times people just automatically want to, touch it. And it's like, yo, personal space for one. And it's like, what gives you that right to just touch me, Like, what is it about me that you feel you can just, go into my personal space, touch me, touch my earrings, touch my collares, touch my clothing, touch my hair? That's another thing, is hair, right? Is, when I have my liston, people sometimes are wanting to touch it, and I have to, back away to establish that boundary, even though that boundary was already there from the beginning, And the other thing is, again, this depends on culture and the community, but many native nations believe, right, that when we carry our regalia, it carries within us our energy, our energia, or our medicine. And so when other people touch our stuff, we don't know what intentions they have in touching us. We don't know what kind of energias they can be, putting onto us. And so you have to think about that, or you have to, educate yourself in that way. And that's like the other thing is, I encourage people to educate themselves, on this topic, but also other topics, because you have to actively educate yourself to learn, and so there's that part. And I do remember when I came back from my most recent trip from back home, I was in the airport, and I had one of the rebosos that I had gotten within this last trip. And there was this señora, she also had a rebozo. It was one of the Virgen, the ones that mainly like everyone wears now, with like, I think it's like glittery thread and stuff like that. And you see how I said everyone wears now, right? Because it's mass produced. And what does the little etiqueta often say? Made in China. And it's like, again, are you investing in your local native cultures when buying these pieces? And so I remember, like, this señora, we were waiting for our luggage to arrive. And we were trying to find a seat so that we can sit down and set our stuff down, because we had just gotten off the flight. And so the señora comes up and she sees me because I'm wearing my rebozo, and she automatically goes to touch it. And I back away, and I'm like, oh, and I go like this. I'm like, oh no. And then she's all, and she has, she says, oh, yo no te iba a tocar. And it's like, okay, well, why were you reaching if you weren't gonna touch me, right? And also, you were reaching for me, my personal space. I don't know you. I don't know what your intentions are. I don't know what you're wanting to do. And so she said that, and I'm like, I just stayed quiet, and I just stayed staring at her, because I didn't know how to react or like formulate what I wanted to say in that moment. And I was just like, oh no, just saying like, stuff like that. And then she was trying to say like, oh, what part are you from? And she was trying to make conversation, but I was already uncomfortable from the get-go. And she was just trying to, make conversation. And she was saying, oh, I'm also from Michoacan and stuff like that. And my abuelita had to respond to her questions, because I just couldn't, find the words to respond. And I just didn't want to like entertain any conversation with her because of my uncomfortableness, and also my frustration, and her just automatically wanting to touch me and my stuff. So my abuelita had to respond, and she kept it general. She was like, oh, we're from close to Uruapan and stuff like that. And and then she's also, the señora, she was all like, oh, I'm from Michoacan too, I know how to tejer. Does she know how to tejer? And the way she phrased that as well was like, super condescending, like, oh, does your granddaughter know how to tejer? And it's like, it's still rubbing me the wrong way. I don't want to be around this person anymore. I don't want me or my abuelita near this person anymore. And then she just continues to like make conversation, and she's saying, oh, that's why I wear my rebozo and stuff like that, and I keep my rosary. I wasn't going to do anything to you. I wasn't going to touch you, but it's good to know, it's good to that you think that, or something along the lines of that. But after that, I was just left, to be frank, pissed off. um so it's like, in all these things, how are we, in these experiences and, questions, are you exhibiting or enabling micro or macro aggressions? You have to think about that. I do remember you also asked a question about like, what is it about me specifically that is making me intentionally connect with my culture, and if it has to do with gender. I don't know if it necessarily has to do anything with gender. I think it's more so like the intent, right? So it's not to say my brothers don't care for the culture, because I think it's more so the upbringing. I was raised this way. I was, actively questioning and asking questions, but also, I have different experiences than my older brothers, than my youngest brother. And so I can't necessarily answer that question for them, but I'm also seeing them, my oldest brother, I'm seeing him ask questions, now. He's older than me, but he's asking these questions now. And so I think, I'm seeing that change in him. And I think it's at the same time, sometimes it takes, very pivotal moments to shift our worldview. And like, that's like something that he's asking. I remember like growing up, we knew we were purepecha. I knew I was purepecha. I didn't necessarily know what it meant to be purepecha or to walk that way of life until afterwards, right? After I asked those questions and intentionally asked those questions and held those conversations with my elders, with my family. And so I think it's like, you have to think about that, like the experience, and also of like people's individual experiences. And also, maybe, they didn't have that same upbringing that I did. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable enough because the environment wasn't, a safe environment to ask those questions. I wouldn't necessarily know. I only know my own experience. But, again, I'm seeing my brother ask these questions, and, I think it's important to have these conversations. Perhaps that's why, he wasn't aware, or, stuff like that. And like, I think one of the questions that he had asked was like, oh, like, what, so are we native, or is it we're native on mom's side because we're purepecha and stuff like that? And it's like having those conversations, right, about what does it mean to be native, who is Native American, and stuff like that. And also recognizing how the colonial structure, I guess you could say, push these labels onto us, because, we all have our own names that we call ourselves in our own languages, whether it's purepecha, right? Other people commonly refer to us as tarasco, and that's just not who we are. Again, that's many of us consider it a derogatory term. It does vary depending on who you ask, and each person can give you a different response. But, the way that I was taught is tarasco is not who we are. That's the story that came with us becoming known as tarasco, was because when Spanish colonizers, right, came into contact with Purepecha people, and afterwards, either forcibly took our, women within our culture, or, they built a connection, or, were trying to establish ties to maintain and have a way to, I guess, in a way, save our culture, perhaps. But when they were, despidiéndose, they were saying like, goodbye, son-in-law, in Purepecha, and I believe it's Tarasco, or I think it's pronounced Tarasco. I'm not too sure, but it's a similar spelling to Tarasco. And so because that's what the only part that they heard was Tarasco, they automatically labeled us, oh, those are the Tarasco people. But we're not Tarasco, we're Purepecha, or Pure. And the thing with that too is because many languages were only, passed down orally, or we had a lot of oral histories, we didn't have a written language until afterwards. And so you'll also see that, the writing of words changes because our language wasn't originally a written language. And so that's something that, my elders have taught me, is like, there's no necessarily right or wrong way to speak Purepecha. There's no necessarily right or wrong way to write in Purepecha, because, we are an oral history. A lot of like our traditions were passed down orally, and we are like an oral language, and we weren't originally a written language. But and I remember having, like, I think it was over the weekend actually, when they came by, they visited me over the weekend, so it was nice to have that, my family, right? And I remember us having a conversation about that, because we were playing pirecuas, which is our traditional music, which is in the Purepecha language. And pirecuas in it of itself is resistance. We've been able to maintain these traditions throughout colonization, and we've been privileged enough to do that because of our elders and the esfuerzo that they put into maintaining this culture. But I remember we were putting pirecuas, because my little nephew, he loves hearing the pirecuas, and they were telling me, he's been spending a lot of time with Nandekere lately, so he's becoming, he likes the tamborazos, he likes the sounds that he's hearing. That's why he's like dancing, or that's why he's laughing, right? He's having fun because it's familiar to him. And I love that. I love that he's being raised in the similar, if not, a better way than I was raised. I remember having, or my abuelita playing that on the cassette. She has like this little CD that of like pirecuas, and I know that she has a couple others too, like playlists and stuff, right, of pirecuas, and that she's been able to share with us, again, to establish and maintain our connection to culture. And so, yeah, and it's beautiful to see my nephew, being raised in that way, and I love that for him. And it's so funny to see him just like dancing around, and like something for us, like, I think sometimes dancing is like a way of like to experience joy, and remembering how joy is resistance as well. But yeah, and so I think those are some things that you have to take into account when looking, or when you see people wearing their regalias. You can't just touch them. You have no right. You have no, why would you feel that you have the right? Again, we all have boundaries. How would you feel if someone just reached for you and wanted to touch your hair, or wanted to touch you in general, right? You would feel automatically uncomfortable because I don't know you. I didn't give you permission to touch me. So it's like these things that we have to take into account. But yeah.
And so, again, it brings so many of these pieces together in regards to who you are, your identity, how your regalia is part of that identity, the idea of energy as something that is constant, and either people can put negative energy towards you, or people can take positive energy away from you that could lead to illnesses and all of this. These are ancestral ways of believing. And so I know that you have a poem that you were sharing with me before we started recording this. And maybe this is the time to get to that poem, because I think it brings all of these pieces together.
Yes, and as Rafa mentioned earlier, there is cussing, because when I originally wrote this, I was very mad. So this is called Mamadas. This is draft Ma, which is one in Purepecha. And I initially wrote it September 7th, 2025 at 5:32 p.m. Mamadas. La mera neta, ¿qué chingados les dé el derecho a tocarme? A tocar mis collares, mi medicina. A tocar mi rebozo, mi cuerpo. You look like you have some native blood in you. I hope you aren't offended by my comment, by me saying that. O sea, what the fuck? Entonces, ¿cómo quieres que me siente? Shit, I don't even know how the fuck I feel. Because no matter how often it happens, I still get shocked. I still get thrown off. Because it doesn't matter that I shouldn't be offended, that they didn't mean offense. I still gotta carry that shit. I still have to deal with that shit. Me. Hey, okay, Pocahontas. I bite my cheek. We had stopped at the gas station because homie needed to go to the bathroom. I was making my way through the aisle when the store clerk said that. I bit my cheek and paused. I paused because I almost was too quick. Entonces I paused and didn't say anything. In my head, I said, that isn't the compliment you think it is, because we can get into a whole convo about Matuaca. I had my trenzas con listón. They were shades of blue y creo que morado. I had gotten them in Pama with my Nande Sapichu Erendira. Anyways, I love when my listón cuelga y vuela en el aire, una danza entre listón ca tariata. Me siento como queen, con mi listón como alas, y como un pájaro choqué. This clumsy bird crashed. Face first, o más bien, me dieron una cachetada. The reality of living life as a native Yuriskiri, to be an indígena fool in this bizarre reality.
And again, I think what we've been talking about almost for an hour now really comes together with this poem because of all those truths that you mentioned, right? It is frustrating as an indigenous person to live in a society that minimizes who you are, who your people are, and the fact that every time you walk out the door in your regalia, every time you open your mouth to share some knowledge, you're speaking the truths of your people for a millennia or more, and yet are often reduced to, again, somebody making a comment, somebody trying to extract your culture and reselling it for their benefit, as again Adidas has done, Nike has done before, and of course now Puma is getting itself into this. Um, and there is zero compensation to the people who actually originally designed, created any of this clothing that is now being stolen. And then for me, one of my personal frustrations is always how those anthropologists, for example, have always gone to our communities, extracted the knowledge with good intentions, and then write those books that go for $50 and $100 and $200 each, but never go back and say, here is 50% of what I made from the sale of your knowledge. Or why don't we open up a museum or a place where you can actually put all of your textiles for sale that you're going to benefit, or whatever the situation may be for the individual group, but there is no respect, right? And so I like the fact that you wrote this poem where you can actually show and share what I would see as the frustration of not just the Purepecha people, but many indigenous peoples of this land and the ancestral lands where you and I come from, because this is very common, right? And then some other time we can have the conversation about chingada, right? And chingona, because it's an important conversation to be had as well. And that puts us in connection with La Llorona and what is it called? Malintzin, and so on and so forth. So that's a conversation for another chisme for another day. But I think it's important that, again, we're having this conversation today here with you. And so I'm going to ask you, what are your maybe last comments that you want to share with people today here on Chisme is Live? Because we have you scheduled to come back a couple more times in the near future. And one of those for sure is as a first generation college student. But for today, for the topic that we are covering today, what is your final comments that you may have?
I think something that came up for me when you were talking, right, is how you were talking about how anthropologists come into our communities and they like to study us, right? And they like to study our ways of life, the way we live, the way we speak, the way we carry ourselves. And it's also, again, like I'm actively learning. And so what we're learning about in class right now in my women narrative and history class with Professor Atala, or as they would phrase it, badass women of color, is, authoritative voices and dominant voices, and how, and I really truly see that with anthropologists. They come into our communities and they study and they write and then they publish these books, and then they become the experts in our culture. When we speak, we are no longer seen as an authoritative voice. What we say, our truths are no longer true. We're now questioned. We're like, oh, is that truly real? Let's ask Dr. So and so, about this person's own culture. And it's, you have to recognize, and you have to also learn to look at the world through that lens, where you're constantly analyzing and critiquing stuff. Because once you look at the world through that lens, you'll start noticing these things, and you'll never be able to look at the world as it once was before. And it's, how people say, right, how ignorance is bliss. And we have to fight that narrative. We have to escape, ignorance. We have to challenge ignorance. We have to actively continue to learn and learn from others perspectives and stuff like that, to shape our own. And so again, dominant voices and narratives, they become, these anthropologists, they become the experts. And again, they exploit not only the people, but also the land in itself. And it's also, you have to think about that. If any of you are anthropologists or wanting to take the anthropology route, is you have to think about the intent of your work. What is you writing this piece going to do? How is it going to impact the community you're writing about? In what ways are you contributing or harming, the narrative? And that's like the other thing, is for a long time our histories were told by somebody else, because we only had oral traditions, and they were the ones who wrote it out and published it or whatever. And so now that becomes this one narrative that is associated with our pueblos or our nations. And so you have to think about that, and you have to actively learn. And I encourage people, like, if they're wanting to learn about pueblos originarios, look to different organizations, get educated in that. There's various organizations across, Turtle Island, that are educating and, are established to maintain cultural connection for people who are from pueblos originarios or other different native nations, and are, living within and, occupied Turtle Island, and specifically within the US, or this colonial border and structure, right? And so there's also, like, ways people are actively resisting in that way. I remember, I think earlier today, I actually came across an organization that maintains specifically that caters to the pueblo originarios of what is known as Oaxaca, right? And so it's not just a specific nation, but all these different nations, because Oaxaca is so diverse, everywhere so diverse, with different native nations, pueblos originarios. And I think it's really important that when people are wanting to learn about native cultures, you also have to support and invest in native cultures. What does that look like? How can you actively show up in that way? Is it, through monetary, or like through economic ways? Here we have an honor tax. So I encourage people to look that up. Is there an honor tax where you're locally at, where you can give your money to local tribes, invest in local tribes? We have to learn from them as well, attend the events that they organize, whether on campus, off campus. You have to support their events, because oftentimes if it doesn't get, that's another thing, is like advertising. Sometimes it isn't advertised enough. So if you see a native event, repost it, share those information, share those resources with the world. That's how we need to, show up for our communities. We must visibilize each other, because for so long we were invisibilized, and I think that's something that I'm learning, is like, I don't know how to, like, I guess, show you, but like, invisibility, right? how we are actually erasing people's histories when people from dominant cultures or from other cultures are wanting to tell our stories and represent people, but in wanting to represent, we're actually erasing their history, and we're actually, actively dismantling their history. So you have to look at that. And you also have to look at positionality. Is me giving, public comment, get educated as well in like local efforts to remove dams, learning about dams in itself, how they're so harmful to the environment, and also getting educated on how there's different dams. That's something that I learned this week. Here we're celebrating Indigenous Peoples Week because Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day, but as every other pueblo originario and nation knows, every day is Indigenous Peoples Day. And so I encourage people to get educated. If there are any events regarding Indigenous Peoples Week or days, attend those events, attend with an open mind, with like the intention of learning. But yeah, that's I guess one piece that I would like to share or leave people with.
Definitely. And again, I want to be clear as my last comment here before I thank you for your time. There are anthropologists from, for lack of better words, first world countries, right? From the people who originally created the oppression of the people, of the indigenous peoples, who go to these spaces, not just within the US, but in Latin America and other spaces. And there are anthropologists who are trying to create healthy spaces for indigenous peoples to share their stories. So I want to be clear about that, because I am privileged, and you've met Dr. Lourdes Baez, Dr. Lulu, over at the National Museum of Anthropology and History in Mexico City. And she is an anthropologist who actually came up with the idea and created this great exhibit of because in the past they would talk about indigenous peoples as, again, people of the past, they don't exist, they all die, blah, blah, blah. But the exhibit, for anybody who's able to travel to Mexico City, the exhibit is that one that shares the current stories of the peoples of Latin America, specifically Mexico, but it expands into other areas. And so El Rebozo that you were showing earlier, that blue Rebozo, they have it there, not because it's something that is from the past, but it's something that is here today, and those peoples are still here today. So again, I want to be clear. There are those who extract knowledge for their own benefit, and as you clearly said, become experts. And then there are those who say, no, let me create this space where you can tell your own story. And there's a difference between the two. So with that, I want to thank you, Erandi, for taking the time. I know you're in school and you're studying hard in an area that you really are enjoying to learn about. So I'm glad that you're doing that. And I look forward to our next conversation here on Chisme is Live. And again, thank you to all of you all who are signing up on our YouTube channel and our podcast to listen to these wonderful conversations with people like Erandi, who today got the opportunity to speak about her own experience as an indigenous person and how not every experience is a positive experience. So thank you, Erandi, for taking the time, and I look forward to our next conversation.